Hello, everyone. The next session is about to start. السلام عليكم. مرحبا بكم ضيوفنا الكرام في هذه الجلسة المثرية والتي هي بعنوان وضع أطر جديدة للاستدامة، تجاوز مقياس الناتج المحلي الإجمالي. طبعاً تستند أطر الاستدامة العالمية إلى افتراض وجود ترابط بين النظم البيئية الطبيعية والاقتصادات المحلية، لكن هذا الرابط غالباً ما يكون ضعيفاً أو معدوماً في الدول الحارة والجافة التي تفتقر إلى موارد طبيعية متجددة ووفيرة. فثروة قطر الفريدة من الموارد الطبيعية غير المتجددة على سبيل المثال تخلق فرصاً وتحديات أيضاً لتحقيق التنمية المستدامة. وتتمتع دولة قطر ودول خليجية أخرى بأعلى نصيب للفرد من حيث ثروة الموارد الطبيعية غير المتجددة على مستوى العالم، مما يتيح لها دعم الاستثمارات في مجالات التكنولوجيا والبنية التحتية والتعليم والصحة. ومع ذلك ونظراً لبيئاتها الحارة والجافة وارتفاع درجات الحرارة الشديدة ومحدودية المساحة وعدم وجود مصادر للمياه السطحية، فإن القدرة الحيوية لهذه الدول وحدها لا تكفي لإعالة سكانها. ستبحث هذه الجلسة مدى إمكانية توسيع نطاق استخدام إطار الثروة الشاملة ليشمل دولاً ذات ظروف مناخية حارة وجافة والتحديات التي تعترض تطوير هذا الإطار بشكل أكبر. Please allow me to welcome to the stage Dr. Gonzalo, the Executive Director of Earthna, to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming to this session. And this is about what do we mean by sustainability when we look at a country like Qatar. So as a think tank focusing on sustainability, the first question we asked 3 years ago was, what does it mean to be sustainable for Qatar? How do we measure it? So we're releasing a report today that addresses precisely this very important question. So we need to start with the geography. Qatar is a small country. It's the size of the New York metropolitan area, just to give you an idea of the size of the country. And it's a very hot country. In fact, if you go outside today, yesterday was better, but today it's going to be hotter. Most of the year is really incredibly hot outside. So life here is not very easy. Now, Qatar has records, when we look at it comparing with other countries, on many dimensions. Annual precipitation out of 182 countries is 179. So it's one of the driest countries on the planet. And because of that, above ground biomass, the plants that grow, is also one of the lowest on the planet, 191 out of 195. So it's a country that doesn't have primary productivity. When we look at agricultural land per capita, again, 186 out of 195. There is no agriculture. The soil cannot sustain agriculture. And yet, when we look at gross domestic product per capita, it's one of the richest countries on the planet. It's between 1 and 4, depending on the year, out of 195. So how can a country be so rich without having the resources that traditionally sustain economies? So we look at some of the measurements of sustainability and some of the frameworks, and this is one of the most used ones, the Global Footprint Network. And here are the most sustainable countries, okay? French Guiana, Suriname, Guyana, Gabon, Congo, etc. And the least sustainable are on the right, and Qatar is right here. Okay, so somehow, very rich country, no resources, unsustainable. So something is wrong here. What is wrong here is that this methodology divides the size of the economy by the size of the biocapacity. And because it doesn't have biocapacity, then of course it looks as if the economy is sustained by a few plants, which is not the case. So we look at a different framework at several ways to measure this. And we chose a methodology that was developed by the World Bank called the Changing Wealth of Nations. This is a methodology that has been developed over 20 years, starting with the question, how do we internalize externalities? How do we measure natural capital? How do we know that when a country is killing its whales, it appears as it's making money, but you are destroying your natural resources? So this, the first report was in 2021. This just came out, the second report. And we started to figure out how to apply this framework to a country like Qatar. So this is a first study, a country study using this framework. This is called inclusive wealth. And what the framework does is, for each country, identifies the types of capital that the country has: natural capital, human capital, knowledge capital, physical capital, social capital, institutional capital. So inclusive wealth is comprised of the interconnection of these buckets of wealth. And they are very technically defined. So this is not just any numbers. These are numbers that are used by United Nations, by the World Bank, statistics, and they're very carefully defined. Of course, I'm not going to go through this, but just to show that point. And what is important is this rule. Inclusive wealth must not fall over time. This implies that rather than the overall level of wealth, net change per capita is what matters the most. So the country cannot go down in its total wealth. It needs to remain the same or go up if it is sustainable. If it is going down, it means the country is not sustainable. And in the latest report, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that are aggregates for the world, okay? The first one is trends in global wealth per capita by asset category. And what you will see is that the world as a whole is becoming richer, produce capital. It has non-renewable natural capital is kind of constant, human capital, but renewable natural capital is going down, okay? And this is consistent with what we heard yesterday from Marco Lambertini. I don't know if Marco is in the audience, where he shows exactly this in a different way, how the Living Planet Index shows that nature is going down while the world economy, countries are getting richer. And when we look at the different, now this is a disaggregation of the last line, which is the renewable natural capital, everything is going down. Agricultural land, water, timber, mangrove, recreation. Only hydropower is going up, but in general, this is consistent with what we know. We are facing a biodiversity crisis. And here we have, again, looking at the world, countries with declining and non-declining real wealth per capita. The red countries are those that are declining in their overall wealth per capita. These are countries that are in trouble. And this is not surprising. Sub-Saharan African countries that are suffering from desertification and are suffering from civil unrest and migration and all of that. This is a destruction of the natural resources that is causing an overall decrease in wealth, which is causing migration and all kinds of problems that we're aware of. So we decided to do the first country study. Sorry, before I go that, let me just show you examples of 3 countries at random of how these different figures come in. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo. The green is the renewable natural capital. Lots of green, there is a lot of forest, it's obvious. The total wealth is 758 billion when you add all of the forms of capital, and per capita they have $9,000 per person. Okay, so this is a country that has $9,000 per person of wealth. Now let me show you my country, Peru. Peru also has green because we have forest. We have been able to create human capital in yellow. The overall wealth of the country is 2.5 trillion, and per capita is only 79,000 because we have a lot of people. And here is Qatar. The overall wealth of a country is similar to Peru, 2.5 trillion. But the per capita is much, much higher, $903,000 per capita, because they have less people. And what is interesting in Qatar is, if you look for the green, you don't see it. Okay, where is the green here? You don't see it. It's actually there. It's just very, very, very tiny. Okay, it's the value of some of the mangroves and some of the natural resources is very tiny. Most of the wealth comes from the brown, which is non-renewable natural capital, which is, of course, the gas. So this is a country that is very rich because non-renewable natural resources. And the question is, how is that wealth being used and whether Qatar is going on a sustainable pathway or not? So what we did is we just released this report that applying this methodology for the first time at the country level and looking at Qatar in great detail towards the development of sustainability framework for Qatar. So this is something that is available if you want to download it on the app. And we measure this all the way going from 1995 to 2018, and we see how human capital is increasing, which is great. The country is investing its wealth to develop human capital. Very little natural capital renewable. The non-renewable, which is the gas, has gone up for two reasons, more exploration and also prices going up. Produced capital, meaning infrastructure. So this is the first one, is also going up. It's everything you see. It's the metro, it's the stadiums, it's the buildings, and all of that. And then, of course, net foreign assets. So they have a surplus. And when we look at the proportion, this is in percentage, then natural capital, non-renewable, always remains a big chunk of wealth. But the interesting thing is that human capital, percentage-wise, remains very, very high. Now, the next step was to compare Qatar with other countries and to see how we can benchmark this. So we compared it with Norway, Singapore, Luxembourg, and Costa Rica. These are just countries at random that we picked. We picked Norway because Norway is a very rich Scandinavian country that also has a lot of non-renewable natural capital. It's a major oil exporter. Then Singapore is a success story. Luxembourg, a small country, and Costa Rica, a very small country. Now, interestingly, when you look at Norway, it's richer than Qatar. It has a lot of natural capital in terms of the oil, and it has also been able to produce capital and human capital. Now, Singapore, the next one, is really, really fascinating because it has no resources. Here, it has nothing, okay? And yet, it has created a very, very prosperous society where the overall total wealth is very, very high, and they have a lot of produced capital and human capital. And it has actually lots of investments, almost $1 trillion in investments. So this is an amazing story where somehow that country has created wealth for the people, infrastructure, with zero natural resources. Then we have Luxembourg and then Costa Rica. That is actually a country that has created human capital, but is in debt. And we can see this in a graph form, where this is now per capita, and we have Costa Rica. We have much richer countries, of course, Luxembourg, we have Norway, we have Qatar, and Singapore. The important thing about this graph is that the overall wealth of Qatar has gone up over time. There are some fluctuations because of prices of gas, right? So you change the price of gas, and this tends to change. But overall, it's a country that has been able to turn its natural capital, non-renewable, in this case the gas, and has built a society with human capital, with infrastructure, and with savings. So our conclusion is that by using this methodology, Qatar is in the right path towards sustainability. And this is nothing new. This is what the Qatar 2030 vision says. But now this is a way where we can actually measure it. So as next steps, what we want to do is to refine the methodology. We're going to try to come up with these reports every 2 years and to see if, in fact, that trend continues. Now, of course, this is just the first step. I think it raises more questions that need answers. So, of course, there is a panel to address these questions, and I want to invite Hannah to come here and help us figure that out.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalo, for that insightful presentation. And to help you think through those next steps, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists to the stage. Today, we'll be unpacking a lot of what's been discussed in this inclusive wealth framework that's being proposed, particularly in the context of hot and arid regions, not only because it's what speaks to our current context, but also because it's a region that GDP might not necessarily reflect the full development trajectory of. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Zainab Al-Bakri, Senior Advisor at Savannah International Consultancies, Professor Lee Howell, Executive Director of the Villar Institute, and Mr. Mohammed Sharif, Director of Partnerships at the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development. So, Mr. Mohammed, I'll start with you, and I'll pick up where Dr. Gonzalo last left off. I want to talk about the various interconnected capitals at the heart of the inclusive wealth framework, and I particularly want to focus on one type of capital, human capital. When we look at the region, we have a region where humans are a vital asset. So over 25% of the region is between the ages of 10 to 24. And if we look at the Gulf Cooperation Council, over 50% of the sub-region population is under 25, which makes humans really a crucial part of the development of this part of the world. So how are investments in human capital shaping the region's development trajectory?
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I wish to thank the organizers. I'm really amazed by the name Earthna. Earthna in Arabic means heritage. But when you look at it from the English side, Earthna, it's both Arabic and English. English means earth, na, it means our earth. Earthuna. It is like in English, you add na becomes Arabic. So this is very interesting. Both, it combines our planet and our heritage. Let me give a little bit background, because this was also discussed, what do we mean by development, because then we discuss about sustainable development and human capital, and growth. I heard from some panelists a couple of days ago, yesterday, that we have to separate the issue of growth, which is GDP, because we're discussing beyond GDP now. We're going to human capital, natural capital, and physical capital. So it is, just to give you a little bit background on this, that why the approach has been to go more towards development and review the society and its well-being, its quality of life, and its progress from development perspective, not from GDP. And this has come mainly in the 60s when lots of projects that had impacted societies and environment, that there was a big loud cry that, listen, this economic development you're doing is impacting the culture, the society, the environment. So this movement in the academia and in the practitioner side of development led to focus and come with some type of new paradigm for measuring the well-being and the quality of life in a society from different angle. And there, the issue of development paradigm progressed. There are about, I can give you about 10 of them, but let me focus on one of them, which is the United Nations Development Program. It's affecting my, sorry. The United Nations Development Program, they came with. They brought two top-notch economists, Amartya Sen, Dr. Amartya Sen from Oxford, and Dr. Mahbub al-Haq. And they, for a couple of months, they reviewed how to approach development and look the context of human being at the center of this development. So they came up with something called the Human Development Index, HDI, which is composed of 3 dimensions: the income, health, education. And it didn't go much because they kept it as an annual index. It just measures the well-being in countries annually. The next stage, they want broadening this. This is what is important for this framework you're proposing, Gonzalo, which is the inclusive wealth. I will come and to add this to make it sustainable, inclusive wealth, just to add this dimension of sustainability, because this Human Development Index, when it was propagated to society, debated at academia, debated at the UN, they realized the issue of intergenerational element in this sustainability. The current generation has to pass something to the next generation. So issue of sustainability, then they came with Sustainable Human Development, SHD, which was very good. It was received very well by the policymakers, by the media, by the academia, Sustainable Human Development. They added component related to poverty. They added component which will come to this inclusive model that you are proposing, aspirations, and putting humans at the center. It's human-centered paradigm. And they also added equity, equality, gender empowerment, and this also in our society, because I was in contact with the media, with the academia, with practitioners, they really love that concept, that human being at the center. So human beings, like for example in Islam, in Quran, they emphasize on such a thing, that this planet, the center of it is human being, all the surroundings, biosphere, atmosphere, everything is being done for this human being. So this was, but then the difficulty of this was two things. There was big motion taking place at the UN to come with a really broader framework, structured, that can be measured. And the policymakers, when they came to sustainable human development, because then we have to see this inclusive wealth also that will be presented to policymakers, what type of reactions they might have. Sustainable human development, when went to the policymakers, they said, okay, now this is good at the policy level, we have to turn it into action, but how is it? I mean, we don't understand this. We know GDP is very easy. Let's calculation this, we are number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How to turn such things? This was going on, then the UN decided to come consensus with countries, policymakers, NGO.
Mr. Mohammed, can we actually get some perspective from Professor Howell, who has been observing these global trends and these global shifts that you're discussing, sustainable human development, alternative frameworks that have emerged as part of the global backdrop of this conversation?
Sorry, I will come back to this, all right.
Yeah, no worries, we'll come back to you.
Sure.
Professor Howell, so I want us to, move away a little from the region and look at a more global level as to how these conversations have been playing out and how they've been evolving. Now, you've been monitoring these major shifts in economic paradigms for a while now. You've overseen the World Economic Forum's flagship Davos meetings for over a decade. Can you give us some perspective on how this conversation has evolved and how sustainability frameworks are going beyond GDP?
Thank you. Yeah, so maybe to reframe, first I think it's a great initiative, and I think we diminish the importance of these new frameworks because it's a new, because we're so path dependent, right? We stick to what we know and we're very comfortable with. So let me point to two realities that I think point that this is absolutely in the right direction when we talk about inclusive wealth. The first is, let's look at another discipline that's, because remember this framework doesn't just operate just for economists' sakes. It actually intersects and connects with other narratives and other frameworks. So the first is like just generally, and it was just said just now about being human-centered, is there was a long discussion about is this current geological age the Anthropocene, right? Can we see the geological evidence that humans have shaped the planet in a way that can only be attributed to our species? And interestingly, the geological sort of community, the academics there said, no, not yet. We can't make a call on this. This is last year. But all the other disciplines, please feel free to use this term, the Anthropocene. And I think the reality is we are in this Anthropocene. So we need to understand that we are shaping the face of the planet. So how do we manage and mitigate sort of the externalities, but also more fundamentally respect the fact that the scientists have identified 9 planetary boundaries, right? We've traversed 6 of them, but we still need to prosper within those planetary boundaries. So this sort of framework is very important to understand. So I would start there as one global view that's more science-oriented. The other global view is I would start with more of a political economy perspective, and one that is very simple. And you mentioned the key word, this is intergenerational. If you survey the countries today that have polarization as sort of the defining element of, let's say, how they approach societal issues, but more fundamentally economic issues, there's, I think, an indicator that I focus on, which is when they ask young people in those countries the simple question, do you feel that you will be as, you will prosper as much as your parents or your grandparents? And when you get to the answers that in some cases where this generation doesn't feel that they will prosper as well as the next generation, you can pretty clearly start to see why there's certain extreme views starting to emerge, and supported by these young people. If you look at some of the data, some of the young people in certain countries and economies, they're 30% of that extreme left or right perspective. So this notion that we have to have a framework that is by design intergenerational is really fundamental. That, to your point about sustainability, that we are actually, or Gonzalo's point very initially, is that this is something where we are trustees of the future, and we will bring the future generation as a stakeholder in this is very powerful, because it, again, the science is pointing to the fact that we have to be sustainable and within planetary boundaries. That's very clear, despite what geologists think. And on the other extreme, we know when we talk to young people that their views of the future, and it's all about confidence in that future that ultimately drives investment and real growth, is something we need to take more seriously through the policy framework. And I would just, my last point is that often when things are very transformational, as we're discussing here, we have to work on a narrative that makes it much more, I would say, sort of relevant to most people, right? We have to speak, this is great that we're discussing this here, but I think the challenge is how do we translate this into a way that, even a young person, even someone in high school or grade school, understands that this is what, the goal is. This is the social contract, right? That is about inclusive wealth. So that would be sort of my perspective on this.
Can I just pick up on one of the points that you raised? I know we're focusing on the inclusive wealth framework. Would you say that the uniqueness of that model lies in the fact that it accounts for this intergenerational element in the way it emphasizes human capital? Or would you say that that does not necessarily make this model specifically unique, and that kind of transcends the model?
I think unique, but I think what gets my attention is it reminds me, so by my background, I was born and raised in Japan, right? In our own modernization history, we're very resource poor in that sense of non-renewable natural resources. And this notion that, look at, that chart, that comparison shows that actually if you have the right frameworks, you can still prosper, right? And you can play to your strengths. And it's that allocation, and it's that great sense that, it is the balance sheet that we should all be looking at. I think that's great. And the one thing is that I love about it is that this, in Qatar, that you're going to go further with this. And really, and ultimately, I suppose the measurements will shape the management of those economy. And you have to start somewhere, but once you do, you become part of the other narrative. And in the case of Japan, some economists will know about the flying geese models and others, but there is a knock-on effect. People start to see it's being done in one place. Of course, it's contextualized, for the particular region or the country context. Nevertheless, it's a proof of concept, right? And that's what's really powerful about these things, is that you establish a proof of concept.
And on the note of moving from conceptualization to application, I want to go to you, Dr. Zainab. I think frameworks are as good as their application goes, right? And so let's focus on another context within the umbrella of hot and arid regions, the East African context. So you've covered the East African context extensively, and in East Africa, we have over 70% of the land is arid. It's either arid, semi-arid, or hyper-arid. And so when you think about the inclusive wealth framework, how do you think it's adapted in the East African context, and where does it get its utility from in that context?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this very important session. I mean, the theme I'd like to pick up on is, okay, so we have this inclusive wealth approach and framework. I think Gonzalo has demonstrated well its implications for a country like Qatar. My approach is way of looking at things has been adopted, what are some of the supporting measures that are necessary in order for it actually to be implemented and implemented well? So I just have a list of some of these, what I've called supporting measures for adopting an inclusive wealth approach, and I'll go over them, and I think they would apply more or less to most situations, but I think they're important because without them, such an approach would be difficult to implement. So the first one is that it requires a very strong political commitment at the very highest levels to such a proposed framework, because it is quite new, it is quite innovative, and it needs this political support at the very highest level. I think also that it needs to be mainstreamed across all sectors. So clearly, as we've seen from the presentation, it goes beyond GDP. We're looking at issues like human capital, other kinds of capital, and so on and so forth. And so this idea that it needs to be mainstreamed across all sectors. And then the third very important supporting measure is capacity building. I mean, there has to be very systematic capacity building, again, at all levels, to allow a shift that means gathering different types of data than you would normally for a GDP-based approach. And another thing also, it means that you are actually gathering a lot of different types of evidence for developing and designing new policies. I think another important supporting measure, I think, would be to invest in strategic collaborations internationally. And last but not least, I think the important thing is to realize that if we don't go beyond GDP, we're actually missing out on a lot of very important elements that are very important for any country's development. And here I'd like to focus on maybe 3 or 4. I think this refocus on human capital is very important. A refocus on aspects of inequality, a refocus on issues of security, and even things about how we're going to look at and measure labor, including unpaid work. So I think the point I'm trying to make that in addition to actually developing this kind of inclusive wealth approach, it has to be bolstered and supported by a strong set of measures, which I think I've outlined. I would insist on the political commitment at the highest level that this is the way to go for a particular country. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. And I think as far as bolstering that system goes, like you'd already mentioned, collaboration is really at the heart of this effort. It's a big undertaking. We're trying to revolutionize the way we think about sustainability. And so I'll go back to you, Mr. Mohammed, as someone who's really involved in fostering that effort. How can we build global and regional backing for a framework like inclusive wealth in a way that's robust? How do we actually see the policies be implemented? How do we see the application of the framework through partnerships?
Just a couple of words on the framework itself. And I was trying to focus on this human-centered paradigm, which is the same as inclusive wealth. The issue of human capital becomes critical. Now, as Dr. Gonzalo in his PowerPoint presented, I did also a comparison between GCC and Latin America. And see, the human capital in Latin America, for so many years, they have worked on it at the university. It's the sustainability of these societies. If you look at sustainability factor and remove GNI or GDP, you find them very high. So here, the type of investment that has been done on human capital, that becomes the key paradigm in this inclusive. Now, inclusive wealth, then we have to define the human capital in more details. And then as Dr. Zainab said, the issue of to make this work. I mean, from experience with this sustainable human development and the policymakers' problems to understand this, to turn it into policies and action, this has to be filtered more and simplified more. So when it goes to debate in the society, that this can be turned into a vision for a country, from policymakers all the way to schools. And they have to all understand what is it they're going to be all going towards it. This is a leadership and a vision to be simplified, to be discussed, and then this to be a consensus, same as Mahathir did in Malaysia. Now, in terms of collaboration, now since there are this framework that we're talking about has many components of this framework under the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. However, specific for this region, the issue of climate change being on the top of the agenda, given that majority of the problems here, migration, dry land, is all from the climate change, this area needs to focus on the top of their natural capital, the preservation of the, to help the issue of climate change. Now, how this is one of the key things that international collaboration can be done. In addition to this, the whole framework, I think that requires a good consensus building internationally on this framework. The structure of it, there's lots of experience that the United Nations have, the Arab Fund has, and this collaboration can, to align the SDGs with this new framework of natural wealth. There could be, I reviewed the alignment that can be aligned. Now, there is a new cycle coming. SDGs is coming to an end in 6 years. From now, the debate is taking place, what is going to be the wave after this? For example, UNESCO is emphasizing that the next wave, culture, should be an objective by itself, culture and sustainable development. Just 3 days ago, the Secretary General, through UNESCO, has asked to review the progress in this. So this is also the inclusive wealth we're talking about, grasp the tradition here, the local tradition, the local species, even if it's limited. You're talking about marine resources, you're talking about the birds, whatever, it's limited. But the sustainability, this is a natural resource sustainability, tradition, culture. So this is among the things in collaboration with the international organization. The Arab Fund can assemble meetings, workshops, capacity building, refine this workshop. For example, you have to have a good accounting for this new paradigm of wealth. This wealth of capital wealth, natural wealth, human wealth, putting all together, this new paradigm, the Arab Fund can bring in all the international stakeholders that have experience in this. So this can align it, it becomes part of the, for example, the World Bank has its own accounting for this, for the wealth. So this type of international collaboration and financial incentives. For this paradigm, when if it's...
Can I actually pick up on the example you just raised about the Arab Fund and try and engage Professor Lee on how we can expand the application of a groundbreaking proposal like that? Professor Howell, so like Mr. Mohammed mentioned, we have 6 years until the timeline for the SDGs is up. I don't know how far we've come in achieving them. I think that's up for debate. But we have Mr. Mohammed here proposing, for instance, that the Arab Fund could pool resources to try and support the increasing implementation of the inclusive wealth framework. What are some other key policies or mechanisms that can support the application of this framework?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would just endorse, I think often, when you need to get things done, the key is coordination, right? You want to reduce as much coordination cost as you can, right? And that's intuitive, I think, when you try to do this. But I think there's another piece where I suppose sometimes economists are similar to engineers. We get very enamored with functionality, right? I mean, and not focus on usability. That's if you take a kind of a metaphor from software development. So we have the SDGs and a number of different indicators. And somewhere in that reality is, in terms of usability, the use case will probably be like in many of our own day-to-day experiences with all sorts of common software tools, is that you'll see the Pareto principle kick in, where 20% of the values and 80% of the value comes from 20% of the function. So there's maybe in that two things to consider. One is back to the notion of simplifying this. How can we make it more easy? What's the narrative that embraces everybody? The narrative that invites everybody in to consider this as a vision or goal, right? So you get better alignment, which reduces coordination costs. But then I think fundamentally there should be some lessons learned from not just the SDGs, which to your point, there's certain goals that we've set that are unlikely to be met at the current trajectory. But what does that mean? What's the narrative beyond that? That's why, for example, I like the planetary boundaries. It's not, it's not about success in the 17 SDGs. It's a bit existential because we need to maintain, right, to prosper within those 9 boundaries, and we can sort of realign things. But I do think it is a moment in time where we'll need a narrative that is again aligns these different goals, to some degree simplifies it so people can buy in at every level. Still transformational, but people kind of get it, and so in a way, it's not a technical question. It's really an adaptive challenge, right? Because you're asking people. Technical problems, you know the problem, you know the solution, you just have to put the resources behind them. An adaptive problem, fundamentally, is behavioral, mind shift change, right? So it becomes a communication exercise to some degree with certain proof points, but fundamentally, I think we have to recognize that there is, for most people, they're going to see their value in not in everything you do, but in parts of it, and then it's to really just talk to the stakeholders and start to figure out what that narrative is to engage them would be my recommendation in something like this. What's great is, though, it's on solid ground, right? I mean, it's a really robust framework that actually is anticipatory, because I think it does anticipate the challenges we'll have achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and it does anticipate the fact that we need to probably, all businesses will have to think about their own audit when it comes to the planetary boundaries and what they're doing in each of them. And there's some good stories there, like the stratosphere and the ozone, progress in one of them at least. But so again, to your point, yeah, let's try to build a narrative around its usability and not its functionality. It would be my key advice to any policymaker that's going to go out and sell this.
And I think one key tension in that's very notable is the idea of balancing technicalities with adaptability. It's like you said, it's also about ensuring that not only that these frameworks are implemented, but also that they're sustainable in the long run and that they outlive our generations, right? So Dr. Zainab, I want to circle back to you on that note and ask you, when we're looking at the context of hot and arid regions that are really in need of adaptable frameworks in order to account for their unique realities, what becomes necessary in that calculation do you think will be vital to ensuring that we're effectively measuring sustainability or sustainable development in this context?
I think for all countries, the essential point is going to be having the data necessary to do this kind of analysis. I think I made this point earlier, but I would like to re-emphasize it. That you need the data because it provides the evidence for policy change. And I think one of the issues that we have in a lot of countries is data are not robust. And there are issues with even building the capacity to actually gather this kind of data. So I think we have to recognize that is an area that is an absolute must. You absolutely need to build capacity in order to be able to gather the kind of data, because it's not your regular GDP kind of data. And there are lots of different kinds of nuances and possibly qualitative data that might need to be gathered. So I would really emphasize the importance of looking at data at a different way, and the importance of ensuring that the infrastructure to gather this new types of data is there. Thanks.
On mechanisms, can I briefly just ask you another question? Are there any mechanisms you would propose to support the data gathering process?
I mean, I think there has to be investment in, setting up the necessary infrastructure for collecting data. I think one of the issues and the weaknesses that all countries face is how do we ensure that this data is robust, is systematic, and that it's gathered in such a way that is usable, and that it provides the necessary evidence for changes in policies.
Thank you. Professor Howell, yes.
Data, I just want to highlight, it's sort of a paradox, but so we have to start with the premise that we live in an era where there's more data available to us than any other civilization combined, right? I mean, this is, right, we're talking, if you talk to technology people, they'll talk about, the zettabytes of data that have to be stored and how we're going to do that, because and of course there's different, in the other extreme, there's this notion that unstructured data is now much more manageable and accessible, particularly through large language models and artificial intelligence. Somewhere in the middle, there's a reality, there's a last mile or last kilometer problem. If we could focus on that piece, because at the macro level, we have the infrastructure to store, and we have the processes to take the unstructured data to deal with it, but we're still missing these gaps. And I think exactly what the point is, if we can sort of correct ourselves and what are those gaps, and what are the proxies, because you can't always have the perfect data either. And so can we be creative about what would be the proxy data too?
Do you have a final note? Very briefly, Mr. Mohammed.
Yes. I think the data is important. Before the data, I think we have to strengthen the credibility of this model through this collaboration with international organization, and then come with a shared standard how to measure the wealth. So it becomes part of this global measurement system and accounting. Then in this process, for example, the Human Development Index went through tremendous trouble on the data. And they solved it. Like if you go now to the database, it's highly populated with data. So they solved lots of these nitty-gritties on the data. But they standardize the measurement. This is the good thing that everybody can use it. For inclusive model as well, the collaboration with the Arab Fund and the international, which we're going to bring in terms of, so they can, when it becomes standardized, then it can be applicable to other countries as well. And this can be at the international level as well acceptable, especially the accounting side of it. So these are very important things as a next step, I'm saying, because this is a very important model, it's an important framework for this region, because it's capturing all the natural, renewable assets and the tradition, which that is not capturing in other frameworks. So for this reason, it's good to work from this beyond to standardize it, make it credible internationally, and then the type of data, it will be determined there, and it can be filled in quickly.
Thank you. So Dr. Gonzalo, Professor Zainab, yes, please.
Sorry, I just want to re-emphasize a point that I think I made also at the beginning, which is political commitment. I think that in order for these kinds of sort of more innovative approaches to be implemented well, you do need very, very strong political commitment that will allow that kind of process to be implemented much more easily. Thanks.
Thank you. So Dr. Gonzalo, I'm going to circle back to you. You have a couple of tough challenges you're going to have to take on as you think about the future of the framework, but what is Qatar already doing to implement the principles of the inclusive wealth framework when it comes to investments in science, education, and culture?
Great, thank you so much. Is the mic on? Yeah. Well, first, thanks to the panel, because this is very insightful and it really helped us a lot. As I said, this is just the beginning of a journey to understand what sustainability means for a country like Qatar. I took several points that I think are important as we continue to refine this model and this approach. The first one is the intergenerational approach. I think that's critical. The definition of sustainability says that we need to leave a planet in a better way as we found it for the future generations. So I think that this allows us to actually measure that. And this can actually make governments accountable. Young people can say, what are we doing with our future wealth? Because it's not going up, it's going down or whatever. The second point I think is very important as we refine this. Human capital is not human development. I think that's a critical point that we get out from here. We need to refine that. We can have people that are educated but don't have access to health and education, for example, or other services. So human capital and human development are not synonymous here, and we need to think about how to approach that. Then another point is other dimensions of sustainability, security, inequality, what you mentioned, saying of the labor justice and all of those dimensions of justice that are important. The other point is, Mohammed, thank you for offering for collaboration with the Arab Fund. I'm really, really very happy to hear that, because I think that in this region we need to work closer with others. I think the Arab Fund is a fantastic partner in the future, so I look forward to really working with you and others to help move this forward in the region. And then one final point, which I didn't make in the presentation. when I said that there is no green in Qatar, when you could see the graph, it is because when we value biodiversity in terms of ecosystem services, etc., it doesn't come as a very high number. It doesn't mean that it's not important. And yesterday, for example, Radwan in our team mentioned how evolution has made some of these rare plants very resilient to climate change and to desertification. But there is another factor here which we are starting to forget, which is the ethical values of protecting nature. There is an ethical argument that we need to protect nature. And we are now in another session, we are releasing a book on Islamic sustainability where we have engaged Islamic scholars and they have summarized how, in fact, in Islam, there is a very clear teaching, which is we don't have the right to destroy nature, we have a duty to protect it. So I think that these ethical dimensions, these moral dimensions, and these religious dimensions need to come hand in hand with any other econometric and type of measurement that we're developing.
Thank you for that. And so we've heard from all of our panelists, and now I want to see if anyone here wants to ask any questions. If you want to ask questions, please raise your hand, and a mic will be directed to you. And if you're addressing your question to a specific panelist, please identify that panelist and introduce yourself. So does anyone want to take the first question up? I think everyone's convinced with the inclusive wealth framework then. So, yeah, is there a question? Okay. I'll pose a question to all of the panelists. What do you think, in 1 minute, each of you, what is the biggest challenge to applying the inclusive wealth framework? Yes.
That's the filtration of this at all levels of the society and the buy-in from the youth and others into this if this is not simplified.
Perfect. So it needs to be simplified. Yeah. Professor Howell.
I would focus, particularly if we're going to engage the next generation, on why. Why is the key question, not how you're going to do it, what's going to do, but explain to young people why it matters to them. And yeah, that purpose is, they have a very strong sense of purpose that will align with the norms and sort of values that Gonzalo just spoke about.
Dr. Zainab.
I think political commitment from the top, and also a commitment to accountability for politicians to be able to explain what happens if we apply this framework and what are the consequences if we don't.
And when we think about applying that framework, does it mean also establishing metrics that can allow us to measure the application and the extent of the application of the various dimensions in the framework?
Yeah, or the results. Yes.
Which feeds into the data gathering process that you discussed earlier. And Dr. Gonzalo?
I guess anything I want to say is to thank everybody if we're finishing here for coming and for participating and for your interest in the summit and in this session.
Thank you so much. And so with that, so we have one question. Yes, please.
Is it on? Oh, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Matu, so I'm one of the youth ambassadors for the Earthna Summit. The question that I have is the applicability of the framework when it comes to developing countries, because when we look at the different kinds of capital that they currently have, a lot of them are still falling behind. So we look at human capital, for instance. So many young people are still uneducated, and we are now becoming the youngest continent in the world in terms of the number of people that are below the age of 25. That's the first one. When we look into the produce wealth, again, we are still very much excluded in terms of like value chains and really how much developing countries can produce for the world and the value that they are able to create. That's another disadvantage that we have. And so when we look again on the third type, which is the natural resources, whether they are renewable or non-renewable, again, we're still not there yet, except maybe for countries that do produce oil and do have some sort of minerals. But in terms of all these types of capital that form part of the framework, how do you see sort of developing countries then experiencing the inclusive wealth as well as growing in that? Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. Does any one of our panelists want to take that question up in 2 minutes? That's a lot of sub-questions you're going to have to answer, but is anyone up for it?
I'll take it. I think the answer is fairly easy. A poor country is not poor. Most poor countries have natural resources, and the question is whether you use them to generate development, human capital, and everything. And I think this framework allows people to make their politicians accountable. And I think people, with this, people will have the right to ask, are we using our wealth properly to develop the future, or are we using it in a different manner, which unfortunately is what happens in many cases.
Thank you so much. Does anyone want to add on that briefly? So with that, our panel will come to a close. I want to thank the panelists and the presenter, Dr. Gonzalo, who illustrated the importance of critically assessing traditional sustainability frameworks. The complex nuances of hot and arid environments make rethinking traditional measures of sustainability imperative, and the inclusive wealth framework is a great holistic start for that process. I'm excited to see where this goes, and I wish Earthna the best of luck as they think about the application of this framework and developing it further. I want to thank you all for being such an engaged audience. And with that, I wish you a successful summit. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah.